All right, here we go again. As we get toward the end of the school year, we're just going to kind of tie up some loose ends here with this video and look at a lot of the different groups of people that fought for change during the 60s and 70s. So I titled this the 70s because that's kind of the unit we're in, but understand some of these movements go back into the 60s, and a lot of them you're going to notice continue today. So let's start with probably what today is going to be the most controversial movement, or is going to have the most controversy associated with the name, the Feminist Movement. The women's rights movement. Where did this come from? Well, it had its origins actually within the civil rights movement. And I want to make a distinction here real quick. When you see, like I have up here, the civil rights movement in all capital letters, that refers to what we think of in the 50s and 60s, the African American civil rights movement. If you see a lowercase civil rights movement, it refers to any group of people that are fighting for their own civil rights. So women worked within that African American civil rights movement, and as they did that, they saw inequality in the way they were treated by society. Now, a lot of people are going to say that the feminist movement starts in 1963 with the publication of this book called The Feminine Mystique. The Feminine Mystique was written by this lady named Betty Friedan, and in it, what she wrote about was this idea that women had been raised for generations to fulfill a certain traditional role. And the idea of, the woman should stay at home. She is to be the homemaker. She is to raise the kids and all of that. And Betty Friedan wrote that a lot of women, they'd been brought up believing that if you do this, you will be fulfilled. And what they were finding was that they weren't, that trying to fit into this traditional role just wasn't for them, that they wanted things that would be considered non-traditional. They wanted careers, they wanted opportunities. Women are taught basically, you're supposed to have kids, you're supposed to enjoy having kids, and there are some women out there who, they don't like kids. And Betty Friedan gave voice to that in the early 60s. What kind of woman are you if you say, I don't want to have children? And so a lot of people credit that with the beginning of the women's rights movement. And in the 60s and even into the early 70s, the feminist movement or the women's rights movement, however you want to call it, are going to have some successes. In 1963, there's a law passed called the Equal Pay Act, which declared that men and women were supposed to be paid equally if they performed the same job. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, even though we talk about it with the Civil Rights Movement, also part of it prohibited gender discrimination. You could not discriminate in employment between men and women. In 1966, there's a group called the National Organization for Women that forms. You may have seen or heard of this group called NOW. Well, that's the National Organization for Women. And what they do is they fight for equal treatment of women around the United States, equal treatment in employment, in politics. They weigh in political debates. They fund lawyers to help pay for lawsuits and publicity and all kinds of things, fighting for women's rights. In 1972, Congress passes something called the Educational Amendments. It was a whole series of things of dealing with funding of educational institutions. Specifically, we're looking at universities, but basically any educational institution that receives federal funding, according to one section, is referred to as Title IX. That's what that IX there means, for those of you that don't know Roman numerals. Okay, Title IX requires equal funding by educational institutions for men's and women's programs. And normally where we think of this happening is in men's and women's athletics. Usually we think of this on the university level. Well, in 1972, the United States required universities to start funding programs equally. And so a lot of universities started putting more money into women's programs, women's sports, and you'll see starting in about the mid-70s, American women start to dominate a lot of sports around the world. This is a picture of the 1999 Women's World Cup champions. The U.S. team, with the women's team, has 3 World Cup championships. As some of you may know, our U.S. men's team has 0 World Cup championships. And part of that is due to the fact that for the last 40 years we've been putting more money into women's programs. Of course, we don't care about men's soccer in this country, but we're fixing it. We fired a couple of people after... I'm getting off track, sorry. All right, now there are controversies associated with the feminist movement. I'm not talking about controversies today. I'm talking about controversies from the 1970s. Okay. Some of these are going to involve court cases, and so the first one here, we might not think of this as controversial, but in 1965 there's a court case called Griswold versus Connecticut. The state of Connecticut had made it illegal for doctors to discuss birth control methods with their patients, including married couples who didn't necessarily want to have children. Well, a lawsuit is filed over this, and in 1965, the Supreme Court, in this case Griswold versus Connecticut, established this thing we call the right to privacy. The idea that there are certain aspects of our lives that remain private, and the government has no vested interest in monitoring. That case is going to lay the groundwork, that idea of the right to privacy is going to lay the groundwork for a later case, Roe versus Wade. In Roe versus Wade, in the state of Texas, abortion was illegal. Jane Roe, this was a pseudonym given to a woman named Norma McCorvey, she sought an abortion because she could not get one in the state of Texas. A lawsuit was filed, and the Supreme Court ruled that the state had no vested interest in banning abortions within the first trimester. That's the first 3 months. And then after that, the Supreme Court limited the ideas of, okay, where does the state's interest in the fetus or the baby, however you want to refer to that, where does the state's interest exist? But it overturned all these anti-abortion laws in like 46 states. And of course, that's probably the most controversial case the Supreme Court has heard, because it continues to be something that we fight over. Now, also in the early 70s, there's this thing called the Equal Rights Amendment that is put forth. The Equal Rights Amendment was a proposed amendment to the Constitution. It would have prohibited all forms of sex discrimination in the United States. It needed 38 states to be ratified. Real quickly, 28 states ratified the amendment, so it was well on its way. If you've looked at the list of amendments recently, you should know that that Equal Rights Amendment did fail. It ultimately failed, and a huge reason why it failed was a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. That's right, a woman. Works to stop the idea of the Equal Rights Amendment. She led what she called the Stop ERA campaign. Stop the Equal Rights Amendment. What she and others feared was that the way it was written, because it would have prohibited all forms of sex-based discrimination, they argued it would take away what she and others referred to as female privileges. Okay? If you think of some of the more reasonable privileges that women are given in divorce cases, in many states, in the divorce, there's something called alimony, where one spouse has to provide financial support for the other one, and in most cases, that is the husband having to provide financial support for his ex-wife. If he makes more money than she does, he has to automatically give part of his paycheck over to her. That is not the case if the woman is making more money. It is kind of looked at as like, well, sorry, buddy, get a better job. And Phyllis Schlafly said, look, that's kind of a good form or a privilege that women have. Also in divorce cases where children are involved, in probably 90 to 95% of all cases, the mother automatically gets custody of the kids. I don't want to say automatically, but the burden of proof is on the husband to prove that he is a better father than the mother, as opposed to taking a more neutral approach. It's automatically assumed that, well, she's mom, she'll be better. Now, another movement is called the Chicano Movement. You may also see it referred to as the Hispanic Rights Movement or the Latino Movement. Chicano is usually associated more with Mexican Americans, but a lot of people are going to use these terms interchangeably. From where it gets its start from 1960 to 1969, the Hispanic population in the United States tripled. By the time you got to 1980, there was something like 20 million people identifying themselves as Hispanic Americans, and that did not include undocumented workers. Well, we've taken steps in recent years to include undocumented people in the census so that we get a more accurate idea of how many people are actually living here. But there were estimates that, 1/3 of that 20 million could be added. In other words, you'd have about 7 or 8 million undocumented people who weren't showing up in that number. So the number could have been as high as, say 28 million. But whatever, they were one of the fastest growing, and I believe they still are, the fastest growing minority group in the United States. And so in the 60s, as the civil rights movement was in full swing, they also started to see where they were being denied equality, and they started forming organizations to protect their own rights. There's a group out there called the League of United Latin American Citizens. We abbreviate that LULAC, LULAC. LULAC form, you can think of them as the Hispanic version of the NAACP. So they fight for Hispanic rights through lawsuits, lobbying, political activism. There's also a group that forms called United Farm Workers. United Farm Workers was the precursor to it was formed by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. They were Hispanic rights activists. They were from California, Hispanic rights activists. And what United Farm Workers did is it started fighting for the rights of migrant workers. Migrant workers are people who work on farms, typically agriculture, and basically what they do is they move from farm to farm, picking whatever is in season. And so, they might travel up the West Coast during the year, starting out in Southern California picking, say, avocados, and then by the time you get to the fall, they're up in Washington State picking apples. Because they're a migratory group, and because a lot of them also tended to be undocumented, they were given low wages. The farmers would give them, places to live, but, they're going to be substandard housing. And they really couldn't do anything about it because, number one, they don't have a lot of money. Number two, if you're undocumented, well, the farmer can always threaten to just, call the federal officers to deport you. So United Farm Workers was formed to start fighting for these people's rights. There's also another group that formed. This was a political party, La Raza Unida. Yeah. La Raza was a political party based around your identification as Hispanic. It was started in Texas, but it spread throughout the Southwest. It was active in local politics. Okay? So in other words, they're not going to run anybody for president, but they were active in local politics. And they were active through the 1970s. I think there are still some, I don't want to use the word remnants, but there's still some vestiges of La Raza around. But really their political involvement ends in the late 70s. But they do make a huge impact as they start showing the power of the Hispanic population in the United States. Now, there's something else about the Chicano movement, the Chicano mural movement. If you remember back to the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance, where we talked about the artistic expression of African Americans, well, this is going to be the artistic expression of Hispanics and Hispanic Americans and Mexican Americans. And what they did here is they start using the blank areas in cities. So I talked about walls, so maybe the walls of buildings or housing developments or apartment complexes or whatever. But if you look here in this middle picture, the bridge support. This one I believe is in San Diego. And what they did is they started painting these murals on these things that depict Mexican American and Hispanic American themes and heroes and a celebration of kind of their Hispanic culture. And that is a big deal in the Southwest, particularly in some of the urban areas from Texas over to California. Another group of people that has been consistently marginalized, and we've talked about this off and on through our course this year, Native Americans. They're going to be a part of something called the American Indian Movement. And the American Indian Movement, it forms into an organization, but a lot of these things aren't really done by them. It just kind of gets thrown around. Oh yeah, there's a thing called the American Indian Movement. Well, there actually is a specific American Indian Movement. But during the 60s and 70s, they're going to participate in things that kind of highlight the mistreatment and the problems that Native Americans have faced over the last, several hundred years in U.S. history. 1969 to 1971, probably the most visible image of Native Americans and what they're going through was when they took over Alcatraz Island. A group of Native Americans went in and they took over Alcatraz Island. Alcatraz, in theory, you know that this is a federal prison out in San Francisco. Well, it had been abandoned in the early 60s, and so there was one specific treaty that the U.S. government had made with Native Americans back in the a Native American tribe back in the late 1800s that said, well, if the government decides not to use land, then you can claim it, you can come and take it. So this group of Native Americans used that as the basis to take over Alcatraz Island. There's a great document out there called the Proclamation to the Great White Father that is written by these Native Americans who took over Alcatraz, and they explain why Alcatraz Island is perfect for use as a reservation. Now you have to understand when you read it, you're going to have to read it with a lot of sarcasm. Okay? That's the tone in which it was written. It was written sarcastically. Okay? So when they start referring to, our great white father, this is why this is a perfect reservation, because it has no running water. Just like all the other reservations. Okay? That's what it's talking about. In 1972, there's this thing called the Trail of Broken Treaties, where Native Americans were going to walk across the United States, stopping at all these different places where various treaties had been signed, and talk about, look, at this spot right here, this is where we were guaranteed that we would not be moved into reservations. At this spot right here, this is where we were guaranteed that wars would not be perpetrated against us. At this spot right here is where we were told if we give up only this, then the national government would never take anything else. And so they were going to highlight that, and it was going to culminate in Washington, D.C. Well, when they got to Washington, D.C., there was some miscommunication. Federal officials wouldn't see them, but kind of said, okay, well, if you'll go over here, they'll arrange for accommodations, and they'll arrange for whatever. Well, wherever they were going didn't get the memo, and so there was miscommunication, and they ended up taking over the building that housed the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Well, in the course of this almost a week-long occupation, they were getting cold in the building. It happened in the fall, and so they started small fires in the building, and actually destroyed and damaged a lot of Native American artifacts. There were a lot of documents that were lost and taken away, which some Native American leaders said that actually, because these important documents were taken, it might have set their actual political gains or political moves back about 50 years. And so that was very controversial even within the Native American community. In 1973, the American Indian movement occupied Wounded Knee. You may remember Wounded Knee from the 1890 battle or massacre of Wounded Knee, however we want to refer to it. Same area. Okay? A lot of places will talk about this being the Pine Ridge Reservation. About 200 Native Americans staged this occupation where they kind of took over. They were protesting actually what they felt was a corrupt reservation government that had been elected. The FBI cordoned off the area, and read at one point, I want to say it was the FBI fired something like 600,000 rounds of ammunition during this occupation. 200 or so protesters and 600,000 rounds of ammunition are fired. Not too many people were killed. I want to say it only ended up being about 2 or 3. But whatever, what they're doing, the problem with this movement is it was not as organized as the others we've looked at so far, but it highlighted just the problems and the injustice that exists for Native Americans, not only in society, but also on those reservations. There's another movement during the 60s and 70s called the Student Movement. This group existed mostly on college campuses. Some of them were able to get into the high schools, and they came out of the students' involvements with the 50s, the Beat generation, the Beat movement, the anti-war movement, and then also the civil rights movement. As students start saying, wait a minute, these people's rights are being violated, our rights are being violated as well. Some notable things from the student movement: there was a group formed called the Students for a Democratic Society. Students for a Democratic Society actually emerged from several different socialist organizations, and so they argued against capitalism. One of the things they opposed the United States anti-communist policy. They would criticize liberals. They would criticize liberals who, say supported the war in Vietnam or supported continuing the Cold War, saying we were being too harsh on the Soviet Union. There's a document called the Port Huron Statement, which kind of outlined their vision for what they felt was necessary social and political change. There were good things in it. They called for an end to discrimination. They called for an end to segregation. They called for equal rights for all. But there are also some strange things. They said that the political system was messed up. The political parties had screwed everything up, and so we needed to remove political parties and replace them with 2 other political parties. Okay. It was also basically the blame for the Cold War was placed on the United States without, as a lot of liberals would complain, without looking at the Soviet Union and its contribution to the creation of the Cold War. The students felt that no, it was all America's fault, whereas most things are always a two-way street. There's also something called the free speech movement that starts in the 60s. It actually originated in UC Berkeley, where the university was trying to limit student political speech. Specifically, universities around the country were trying to limit anti-war protests. But the free speech movement basically pointed out the First Amendment and argued that anyone who wants to give a political address on campus should be allowed to. We should not silence someone just because they're saying things that we don't want to hear. So fast forward to 2018, where students don't want to hear things from other people's point of views, but I digress again. Now, probably the most fun group in here is the Counterculture. The Counterculture is best described as people who are deliberately defying traditional social norms. Okay, what society says, look, this is what you need to do. This is what has always been done. This is the culture. People saying, no, we don't want to do that anymore for whatever reasons. you probably know them better as the hippies. We love hippies. Think of the hippies. Men are supposed to have short haircuts. Well, think of a hippie man in the 60s. He's going to have long hair, right? Now, they established these things that are called communes. If you don't know what a commune is a society where everyone lives together and everything is shared. Everything that is done for the benefit of the group. And so they established several of these communes around the United States. Probably the most famous was one in San Francisco called the Haight-Ashbury District. The Haight-Ashbury District was, as these people started to move in, it was relatively cheap rents, and they started working together, and there were some really cool things that they did. There's one group that they put together a free medical clinic that offered medical service to people free of charge. There was a couple other places they put together what we might call soup kitchens, but they would provide meals for if you needed a meal, you could come, and they relied on donations and charities, and everybody kind of worked together. It all kind of fell apart. That kind of fell apart in 1967. There's this thing called the Summer of Love, and the Haight-Ashbury District had been popularized as, hey, if you're a hippie, go here. And in the summer of 67, thousands of people from all over the country just headed there because, oh yeah, this is where it's going to be, so awesome, and we're all going to live together. And what happened is it actually maxed out that community's ability to provide for everybody. If I'm providing a free lunch for 10 people, yeah, I can keep that up. But when all of a sudden 1,000 people show up, I can't do that anymore. When the funds aren't coming in. And a lot of the people that were coming were late teens, college students. I mean, they're doing this for the summer. They're not intending to stay there. So if you're not intending to stay there, if you're going to go back to university in the fall, why bother getting a job where you can then earn money to, say, contribute to the group? So we'll just hang out with the group because it's cool. Everybody's going to take care of us. And so that kind of waned. At the climax, what we think of kind of as the epitome of the counterculture was in 1969 with the Woodstock Festival. Okay? This free concert that was held in Pennsylvania, where they expected, they were going to get about 10,000 people to show up for this rock concert. Instead, they got about 200,000. It started to rain the first day they were there, and so 200,000 people in just mud and muck and whatever. But it was 1969. It was the height of the hippie movement, and so you can get on the internet. You can find all kinds of pictures from Woodstock. I mean, everybody having a good time. There's no rioting. There's no looting. There's a ton of trash left over at the end. But it was really kind of awesome. Now, unfortunately, a few months later, there's going to be another free concert put on in California that was going to be, the West Coast version of Woodstock, turned into an absolute disaster. The Rolling Stones were going to play it. They hired the Hells Angels motorcycle gang as security. That should have been a tip-off. Something bad was going to happen. The Hells Angels actually ended up stabbing a young African-American guy to death just about right in front of the stage. And so, the counterculture kind of, the idea of the free love and the everyone getting together really dies after Woodstock in 1969. Now, the last thing we have to talk about here is the environmental movement. Okay? This idea that we got to protect the environment, we got to take care of what's been given to us. You think in U.S. history there's not a whole lot of attitude of, oh, let's protect this stuff, let's conserve it. I mean, there's a whole lot of let's use the environment. What can we get out of it? How do we take from it? Well, by the time we get to the 60s and the 70s, people start figuring out, wait a minute, we might need to take care of what's here. One of the reasons is 1962, this woman named Rachel Carson publishes a book called Silent Spring. And in Silent Spring, what she did is she documented the unintended consequences of the use of pesticide. One of the pesticides that was widely used in the 50s was something called DDT, and I don't remember what it stands for, but it's highly effective at killing unwanted insects. But what Rachel Carson did is she started going through and she started looking at she's a scientist, she's a biologist, and so she starts looking at places where pesticides are being used, and you have, say, a grasshopper that gets the pesticide sprayed on it. Well, even though he's going to die before he gets a chance to die, say a bird swoops in and eats him. Well, now the bird has eaten the poison, which is now, even though the intent was to poison the insect, the bird is now what's going to be killed. Okay? You have the poisons, when it rains, washing off the crops, washing off the fields into the rivers. Well, you have fish, you have frogs, you have anything else that's going to get into that water and get the poison, including humans. Okay? And so she starts documenting this. Other scientific studies are done in the 60s and the 70s that start talking about things called acid rain. We don't use this term a lot anymore, but it's the idea that the water molecules, as they come down in the form of raindrops, they're picking up the different chemicals that are in the atmosphere and becoming, water is supposed to be pH neutral. And instead it is becoming acidic because it's getting these toxic chemicals mixed in with it. And there are several lakes up in the Northwest that are devoid of life. And the lakes, the freshwater, what we think of as the freshwater lakes, are actually acidic. The pH level is off. They start talking about smog in places like LA. LA is like famous for the smog that exists in it, but also water pollution and air pollution. Time magazine runs a front magazine in 1962, I think, where it talks about a river that caught fire. And it turns out there were several rivers through the 1900s that had caught fire. How does a river catch fire? I mean, I don't even know how you start to put that out. Okay? But whatever, people start recognizing, if your river's on fire, you might have a problem. Okay? So in 1970, recognizing these problems, the first Earth Day was celebrated, April 22nd. So we've just come through that. The idea of, we're cutting down trees. Well, let's plant new ones. Trees will purify the air. They help to purify the air. Now let's take care of the earth. Let's look at what we're doing. In 1971, there's also another thing that kind of brings to public attention the idea that we have to protect the environment, and this also kind of goes back to the American Indian movement. This was the Iron Eyes Cody. That's who you're looking at here. Iron Eyes Cody was actually an Italian American, but he played Native Americans, and it's this commercial that's run during the Super Bowl that shows this Native American guy. He's paddling through a lake that it just has plastic bags and other kinds of trash all in it. He walks through a field and there's just trash everywhere. He walks next to a highway and there's cars belching out pollution and a guy throwing food out the window, just not caring at all. And he turns to the camera and this tear rolls out of his eye, and you see the line down there at the bottom. People start pollution. People can stop it. Right? If you care about the environment, and then in the 60s and 70s, related to all of these civil rights movements, but also the American Indian movement, the idea of, what are these people thinking? What have we done to them? What would they say now? Well, what would Native Americans, who we portray as, being connected with the land, what would they say? And so that helps strengthen the environmental movement. So, like I said, that was hopefully tying up a lot of loose ends from the 70s. We only have just a few more days to go, so I hope you can hang in there. Thanks for watching.